Hello, everybody. Again, on this forum of Symposium IAS, today let's discuss another contemporary issue pertaining to environment and ecology. In the last class, we have discussed carbon farming. Today, we are going to discuss what is called as climate finance. Now, Azerbaijan, which is hosting the COP29 this year, has proposed a type of fund which is called as the Climate Finance Action Fund. And this Climate Finance Action Fund would be transferred from the fossil fuel producing countries and companies to developing nations. Although this fund is voluntary, and this would be transferred so that the developing nation can mitigate the adverse impact of global warming and climate change. But when we talk about climate finance is also called as green finance. When we talk about climate finance, let's understand what's the basis of climate finance. So when you talk about the basis of climate finance, there are two main bases. One is called as the polluter pays principle, and the second basis is called as ecological debt. Now, when you talk about climate finance, we know that the adverse impact of global warming is there. Climate change is also there. So the concern is that who is responsible for it? Who should be held liable for it? And against whom punitive action should be taken? Now, there's a rift between developed and developing nation when it comes to the environmental concerns. Developing nations say that we never started this fire. This fire was ignited by the developed countries when the industrialization started in these countries. And the developed countries are regarded as historical polluters. They are called as historical polluters by the developed nation. So when it comes to mitigating the adverse impact of global warming and climate change for adaptation measures, etc., the fund should be coming from developed nation to developing nation. And that is what is called as polluter pays principle. First. The second stand made by the developing nation is that during the imperial or the colonial rule, the developed nations were responsible for utilizing the resources of the developing nations. It's a time that they should repay back that to the developing nation in the form of what is called as climate finance. Now, that is what is the basis of what is called as ecological debt. Now, when you talk about climate finance can be defined in many ways, but the proper definition of climate finance is what? That it is the finance, it is the fund, financial assistance, which would be coming in the form of grants. And this financial assistance would be coming from the developed nation, which would be called as a global north, to the developing nation, which is called as the global south. The purpose is mitigation measures. The purpose is adaptation measures. When you talk about mitigation is for the purpose of reducing emissions. When you talk about adaptation is for lowering down the adverse impact of global warming and climate change. And let's see what are different forms of climate finance, or what is called as green finance also. Let's talk about that. Now, climate finance can be local, it can be national, it can be transnational, it can be privately funded, it can be public also, and can be through alternate funds also. But if we talk about the different forms of climate finance, let's talk about different forms of climate finance. One form of climate finance is the global environmental facility. Now, it's the largest source of multilateral fund for this purpose. And this was established in 1991. It includes 186 countries. The purpose is to address the concerns related to biodiversity, climate change, international waters, the POPs also, replacement cycle of this facility is 4 years. So it should be replenished in 4 years. The another finance is small grants program. Small grants program is supported by Global Environment Facility only and is implemented by the UNDP. It was launched in 1992. The Earth Summit was conducted, and in this program, grants up to $50,000 would be given to the local communities. In India, we talk about who is responsible for hosting this program. The Energy and Resources Institute of India is responsible for hosting this. Another type of fund is called as Special Climate Change Fund. This is operated also by the GEF, and this is meant for those projects which are related to climate change. And this is meant for not only adaptation but also technology and capacity building. And this was established in 2001. So that also comes under climate finance or the green finance. Another mechanism which was started in 1997 under the Kyoto Protocol is the Clean Development Mechanism. And under the Clean Development Mechanism, we can see that the carbon reduction projects would be transferred from the developed nation to developing nation. The developed nation would be responsible for establishing these projects, and the developing nation would be responsible for maintaining it. But the credits, the carbon credits which are earned through this project would be straight away going to the developed nation, but developing nation would get technology from the developed nation. Developing nations would also get capital money from the developed nation as such. So we can see threefold benefit for the developing nation: better environment, technology, and also money. So all these comes under the ambit of climate finance, or which is called as green finance. But one form of green finance is also the Green Climate Fund. Now, negotiations for Green Climate Fund were conducted in the year 2009 at Copenhagen, but it was set up in the year 2010, and this was at COP16, which was conducted at Cancun. Under this fund, we can see $100 billion would be transferred from the developed nation to developing nation every year. And this mechanism was to be up till 2020, it was to be transferred to the developing nation. But under the Paris Declaration, we can see one significant element of the Paris Declaration is Green Climate Fund, because the Green Climate Fund came into force and was one of the important elements of the Paris Declaration. Under the Paris Declaration, it was extended till 2025. We have to think about what happens after 2025. Now, reservation was expressed by US. Obviously, this fund is also based on polluter pays principle. It is also based on ecological debt. But reservation was expressed by US on this fund, and US said that this fund is largely going to benefit the developing nation. In fact, it said also that the Paris Declaration is largely going to benefit the developing nation. And this was one of the main reasons why US walked out of the Paris Declaration. Clear? Now, this is called as Green Climate Fund. Then we can see further Loss and Damage Fund was established. Loss and Damage Fund was established at COP27, which was conducted at Sharm el Sheikh in Egypt. And this fund would be transferred obviously from developed to developing nation, and the purpose is to rebuild the social and physical infrastructure which has suffered from damage due to 3 decades of adverse impact of global warming and climate change in developing nation. That was the main theme. That was the main purpose. Clear? This fund would also benefit the association of small island nation, because they are the vulnerable nations. Already there's a group called Climate Vulnerable Forum of 47 nations which are facing the challenge of global warming and climate change, because they would be submerging in the near future. So this would be benefit those vulnerable nations. And this was implemented. This fund was, Loss and Damage Fund was implemented at the COP28. which was conducted at Dubai. And this fund, donors, any nation can contribute in this fund, and developing nations can apply for this fund also. But a part of this fund has been given to the least developed nation and to the climate vulnerable nations as such. Now, this would be managed by an independent secretariat, which would be based at the World Bank. So this is called as Loss and Damage Fund. So it was set up in the COP27, but it was implemented at COP28 that was conducted at Dubai. Meanwhile, we have to also ponder upon agenda which is called as Bridgetown Agenda. Bridgetown Agenda is of the year 2022, and the PM of Barbados, PM Mia Mottley, was responsible for this agenda, was the main person behind this agenda, and this is meant mainly for the vulnerable nation. Now, the purpose is what? The purpose is to reform the international financial system so that more finance comes to the developing nation, to the vulnerable nation, so that they become more and more resilient towards global warming and climate change. And not only this, the purpose was also to address the systematic issues. So, Bridgetown Agenda was framed in 2022. And the person behind it, you know very well. Next, we can see when you talk about the Azerbaijan proposal, which is called as the Climate Finance Action Fund. Now, this fund would be transferred by the fossil fuel producing countries and companies, and this would be voluntary. Now, this fund, 50% of this fund is meant for climate action programs in developing nations, and 50% of this fund is meant to help the member nation to meet their NDCs, that is nationally determined contribution. Now, the framework of nationally determined contribution was prepared at the Warsaw meet, at the Warsaw COP, and nations would themselves have to decide that what effective steps they would be taking for mitigating the adverse impact of global warming and climate change, and how they would be addressing these concerns. So it won't be in the form of mere promises, but it would be in the form of commitments. So this kind of fund is called as what? This fund, which has been proposed by Azerbaijan, is called as Climate Finance Action Fund. This you have to know. Now, when you talk about that, what are the challenges for climate finance or for green finance? The first thing is that there should be clarification on the definition. Now, whether the definition includes only funding for mitigation and adaptation measures, or whether the definition should include the third international response towards climate change and global warming, and that is loss and damage also, because now loss and damage has also been added to that. Second is that this fund is private fund. So whenever the private institutions would be responsible for funding, they would demand interest in return, and who would be paying that interest needs to be decided. Now, the fund is inadequate. Inadequate why? Because if we talk about mitigating the adverse impact of global warming, to check global warming, the fund which is required according to estimates is $6 trillion by the year 2030. So that is inadequate. There's slow progress. Transfer of technology, it was said under the Paris Declaration that technology should be transferred for this purpose by the developed nation to developing nation. So there's very slow progress on the transfer of technology. Now, this fund is also guided by the geopolitics interest lower than the claim. This is the fund which is really allotted is very less than the claim made by the developed nation as such. And we can see that the fund is mainly emphasizing on what? It is mainly emphasizing on mitigation. It's less emphasizing on adaptation measures. What does that mean? That mitigation measure is for reducing emission. And anywhere in the world, if suppose the emissions are reduced, it would have global benefit. But developing nations want what? Adaptation measures transfer technology from developed nation. On this, the developed nation, they are delivering very less. So it's mainly emphasizing on what mitigation measure and less on adaptation measure. And also it's said that as far as the revision of this fund is concerned, the revision of this fund is called as new cumulative quantitative goal, NCQG. And the revised amount, according to estimates, should be 1 trillion to 1.5 trillion dollars per year, which is required by developing nation or developed nation for developing nation for this purpose from the developed nation. One concern, one challenge is also that in the 90s, when we talked about climate finance, then we can see that some countries were in the middle income group. For example, China. Now, China is the second biggest economy of the world. So there should be new donor nations. China should be included in the donor nations. South Korea should be included in the donor nations. And oil exporting countries like Saudi Arabia should be included in the donor nation. So all these are the challenges related to the green finance or the climate finance as such. Now the last concern related to it, what are the challenges for India? Now the challenges for India include what? That India has declared its net zero by 2070. For this purpose, we require $15 trillion. From where we are going to get this money from? That's one challenge. Second is that green finance, although the government has launched green bonds, but the green finance in India is still in the nascent stage. Then we want what? We want grants, not loans, because loans need to repay it back with interest. Grants are financial assistance given by the developed nation to developing nation. So we want not loans, but we want grants. So if you look at this topic of climate finance, very significant for your civil services examination as well as for other examination, competitive examination as well. Earlier in civil service examination, they have asked you questions on green climate fund. They haven't asked you question on loss and damage fund. And obviously, the Azerbaijan proposal can become a question also in the coming days. They have asked you earlier also question on the global environment facility too. So go through this topic very carefully, and thank you so much.